Assalamu alaikum rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good afternoon and welcome to Talking Point. My name is Faraz Patel. We'd like to thank you, the viewer, for staying with us here on Hilaal TV, DSTV channel 347. The South Africa and United States diplomatic relations continues to probably go as sour as one could have imagined. And this week it was compounded with the announcement by US President Donald Trump that South Africa will not be invited to the G20 Leaders Summit next year in Miami. Well, somebody forgot to tell him that it needed a consensus from most of the G20 nations to say, President Trump, we are giving you the thumbs up. But when you listen to the rhetoric coming from the rest of the nations, it seems South Africa may be getting a sort of favorable response from that. Now, Washington and Pretoria have been at loggerheads since the start of the year. Of course, when AfriForum went and President Donald Trump created this false claims that there's a white genocide that is happening in South Africa, when quite clearly, listening to various organizations, they have debunked that. And he's continued with this rhetoric even when he announced that South Africa will not be invited for the G20 Leaders Summit. Then, of course, we saw in March the dismissal of Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool as the South African ambassador to Washington. So for the first part of this show, Ebrahim Rasool is going to be my guest. Ambassador, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and shukran so much for joining us.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah, Faraz, to you and your viewers. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. Ambassador, you and I think last year this time we spoke, and I must confess, I honestly thought that South Africa and the US relations would probably improve. There would be something that both nations could hold on to. And of course, it's no fault of your own, because we are dealing with the Trump administration that acts the way it acts. 1 year later, are you surprised we are where we are right now? We've got two major sticking points: this false white genocide claim, and of course, South Africa not being invited to next year's G20 summit.
I'm not surprised, but I'm disappointed that we are where we are in our relationships with the United States. I must say that the whole country, if not the world, is my witness that we went there with a good intention, that we went there to secure the trade deals for our country, to improve the relationship with Donald Trump. And you will remember on this show a year ago when I was announced as the ambassador candidate, we even said that we will not change our position on the ICJ and Israel, but we will turn down the megaphone somewhat in order for us to be able to talk the language of transacting a trade deal and so forth. So a year later, I think that any attempt by South Africa to soften its approach to the US has been rebuffed. I think President Trump needed our white community, particularly as victims of a white genocide and as candidates for a white refugee status, which was more important than anything else in the relationship with South Africa. And I must also say, for the record, because people forget it, that before I even said anything to change the voice in the discussion, before I changed anything, we had already lost all our aid. PEPFAR and World Health Organization, we already had the effective death of the African Growth and Opportunities Act, and we already had 30% tariffs imposed on us. And so all of that happened before I called it out as a white supremacist instinct that is at work, given the language of the genocide and given the importation of refugees into the USA.
You know, Ambassador, what's surprising about this is that he keeps on reiterating this white genocide. And as a South African, I find it quite irritating, nauseating, and really downright ignorant from Washington that how many organizations have said there is nothing. It's been debunked. Even when President Ramaphosa went to Washington, the so-called grave sites were proven to be from another African country. If I stand to be corrected, the Democratic Republic of Congo. And yet, on numerous occasions, he keeps on saying there's a white genocide. And there's been a group of Afrikaner intellectuals who came out a few weeks ago to say, not in our name, this is not happening, and yet he is still insisting on it. And I think to myself, there is something more to this, because how could he? How could he say something when even, I'm sure within the US, they are trying to convince him this sort of white genocide does not exist?
You see, Faraz, I'm reaching a point of impatience with President Trump, because he is clearly not interested in the facts. He is trying to flood the zone with the same lies over and over, hoping that some of it will stick. It's not sticking. But I believe that those who have sold him the lies must now be held accountable. I want to believe that it's time for us to ask the question, if you have adopted refugee status in the USA, should we not revoke your return to South Africa, even if you want to come in to your mother's funeral? I think the second question that we must ask is, if you have pleaded with Donald Trump that you are so oppressed and a refugee, whatever assets you have in South Africa, should that not become the property of the state for redistribution amongst the poor who are really destitute? Thirdly, if we are already being punished for land confiscation, so-called land confiscation, shouldn't we be bolder about land reform in South Africa? And fourthly, if those who go over and cause us to lose our aid and our trade, should they not be contemplated to be treasonable and charged with that? Because definitely you don't need economic sabotage if we have that white genocide. I think only when we exercise accountability over the words of Donald Trump will we be able. And sometimes the way to get Donald Trump to change his mind is that we kick the dog so that the master emerges and either changes his mind or he is held accountable.
Another thing, Ambassador, is that when I spoke to you in May, just after President Ramaphosa went to Washington, I must confess, and I think a lot of South Africans also, my fellow media colleagues had said, South Africa tried its best to be as diplomatic as possible, even to an extent, and I'm going to quote Shukri Conrad, our Proteas head coach, to try and grovel towards the feet of US President Donald Trump. And yet, he refuses to. And when I think of a few weeks ago when Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi Crown Prince, went there, it was probably the other way around. It was Donald Trump groveling at his feet. And I feel that the selective diplomacy that the United States is using, and quite clearly when it comes to Africa, and especially South Africa, he just couldn't care. He will treat them as very different to probably his first world peers. I don't know if that's the sense that you're getting, Ambassador Rasool.
I think that Donald Trump today is particularly angry with South Africa. He's always been angry with us, but he's particularly angry with South Africa because what President Ramaphosa did in the last 2 months is he shifted from the strategy of appeasing Donald Trump, taking 2 white golfers and a white billionaire along to say everything is fine here. He's moved the strategy towards what I call contingency. He's taken out insurance policies with BRICS, with China, with others, with the UK. They are now giving South Africa money. The European Union is now beginning to help South Africa. We've taken out those insurance policies. And when it came to the G20, we outmaneuvered Donald Trump completely. He thought that we will be alone here. He didn't expect every other of the 19 to pitch up in South Africa, to sign the declaration, and even the declaration, he warned against it, but 19 great countries signed up for it while he was still asleep in Washington. And so when he woke up, he was absolutely upset. He accused us of breaking the rules when he was breaking the rules all the time. And so now his retaliation is, you won't be invited, but that's a false retaliation. Because he is only strengthening the contingency plan around South Africa, where German Chancellor is even saying, you don't have the right to do that. And I suspect that that is what is going to happen. Everyone is getting tired of Donald Trump's tantrums. And they know that the only reason he's attacking South Africa is because we have called him out on his supremacism. We are the nation that opposed apartheid. We are the nation that took Israel to the International Court of Justice. And therefore, I think he understands the moral superpower nature of South Africa rather than a military or an economic superpower that we can't be yet.
Ambassador Rasool, before we go to the break, one of the contradictions I find coming from Washington is that the United States does not agree with South Africa doing trade deals with Iran, Russia, and China. I want to take China and Russia as an example. You've got President Trump that is basically sitting with Chinese President Xi Jinping to do trade deals. And the Alaska summit, you had Vladimir Putin visiting an American state to try and go ahead and find a peace deal with Ukraine. Therein lies the contradiction. And I feel that if Trump can do it, why can't the rest of the world do it? But when President Ramaphosa does it, or any other nation does it, it is deemed an international violation. And the contradictions are glaring, aren't they?
No, I think that is the double standards of the global system. President Trump knows that one of the key items of the declaration that was approved at the G20 in Johannesburg is that we need a more just, more equitable, more representative global governance system, both on the finances of the world, in the World Bank, IMA, as well as in the United Nations Security Council. And the fact that we got people to say, why is Africa not in the UN Security Council? Why is South America not in it? Why is only one country in Asia in it? I think we are beginning to pierce the walls of global exclusion. And that's what makes them very angry, that we are even raising the issue of African debt, where our interest rates as Africans is 9%. And European interest rates is at 3%. And so we have asked the right questions. And South Africa has the moral authority to ask those right questions, but it is not universally liked and certainly not approved by the United States, because the United States fears that if we continue to ask these questions, the next one will be, should we pay our debts in dollars? Or should we pay in local currencies? Or should there be an alternative currency with which the world does business?
After the break, I continue my conversation with Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool. We're going to be touching on South Africa's G20 and the question of how much of a diplomatic victory has the country scored. Do stay tuned. Talking Point returns after this break. Welcome back to Talking Point. I'm still in conversation with the former South African ambassador to the United States, Ebrahim Rasool. Ambassador Rasool, I just want to quickly go on to this Trump barring of South Africa at the G20. It's going to require, of course, a majority of the nations of the G20 to agree to this. But when you see key allies like especially Germany, Chancellor Merz saying, look, this can't happen, it quite clearly seems as if South Africa have really won over the G20 nations in terms of its diplomacy, which I feel is going to be a bit of an arrow into the chest of Donald Trump.
No, definitely. I think it was a victory for the kind of diplomacy that South Africa has been known for since the days when we negotiated our own freedom and we negotiated peace deals all across Africa and across the world. And so I think that what we have been able to do for this G20 is a two-step. The first step was to confirm that our allies in BRICS and the Global South remain with us. The second step was to accumulate and bring together the aggrieved, those who are suffering under Donald Trump and his tariffs and so forth, and bring them to it. And that's where the European Union and others came in. And so, by and large, I think it was a dramatically good victory for South Africa. And we knew that there was going to be a price to pay, but we have paid so heavy a price already that what more could he do? And so that was the one thing. The second thing was that there was negotiations about language in that declaration. We didn't say, we the G20. What we said, we, the G20 leaders, gathered in Johannesburg. So we didn't implicate Donald Trump, so he doesn't have an argument on that. Thirdly, what we were able to do was to soften things to, for example, make sure that oil-producing states don't feel that they were isolated. We advanced green and clean energy without necessarily attacking fossil fuels too hard. Thirdly, we were sensitive about how to advance women's rights and the girl child's rights and make sure that they never suffer harm and that they have equality without getting into the controversial territory of the full gender spectrum. So I'm saying that we were able to use the language that included people rather than forced people out. And the fourth thing that we did was to be able to say, let's make critical minerals the central theme of this. That was something new that came in. And it basically said that Africa, South Africa, and the global South want to have full accountability over their own critical minerals, and we will only sell it on condition that it's beneficiated, it's not extractive, and that was what Donald Trump wants, and that's the leverage that South Africa, for example, exercised when we say we have almost 90% of the world's platinum, and no car can drive without it. We have 90% of the chromium of the world, and that's absolutely... Africa has 30% of the world's critical minerals. And if the global South continues to play that kind of leveraging role, then I think we don't want to get to a situation of groveling, but we can be treated with respect and with equality.
Ambassador, it's a question I asked many of the guests that we had during our live broadcast at the G20 Summit. The short time in which the declaration had occurred, and I, again, I must confess, I was surprised at it. It was midday on that Saturday. Was it a surprise to you, or did you expect it, given that over the long years, there was really a sense of a consensus, especially with a very important partner within this, the European Union?
I think the tradition was that it always gets, the declaration gets passed at the end of 2 days of deliberations. Then last year, Brazil did it at the end of the first day, halfway through. What South Africa did was to do it after the opening speech of the president. Now, that on the one hand showed how much consensus there was and how much hard negotiations there were in the run-up to the G20, and that by the time the president finished his speech, he was told that the declaration was ready. But if I were a tactician, and I'm not saying that that was the intention of South Africa, but it was the effect of South Africa, we did not give Donald Trump 2 days to phone up every leader and bully them into not signing. We passed the declaration while he was still asleep in the US, in another time zone. And so the fact is, when he woke up, there was no way you could now pick up the phone and phone Chancellor Merz or Prime Minister Keir Starmer or the Australians or the Saudis or whatever and say, don't sign it. It was a done deal by the time he woke up. And therefore, what he tweeted by the time he woke up is that South Africa broke the rules. And he is the one who serially breaks the rules. So I think it was unexpected, but not unprecedented that we brought it forward. And secondly, it was surprising, and it was the kind of strategic maneuver that I think South Africa had learned in its own negotiations, and I think it was absolutely effective. We can now manage the fallout of it because we were never expecting Donald Trump to be happy after he was excluded, or he excluded himself, and everyone else came.
Yeah, that's the thing, Ambassador. He excluded himself because up until obviously the Thursday before the actual summit, South Africa was open to a senior representative of the US coming to take the baton from President Ramaphosa. And I would like to think one of the reasons why the US was so adamant it would not come was down to multilateralism. Part of the declaration of this G20 was multilateralism has to be the order of the day. And that's something Washington is clearly not interested in.
A king, a dictator, or a monarch doesn't give up power. And therefore, if you have a single superpower that operates unilaterally, they don't give up their unilateralism easily. But when the rest of the world comes together and they give birth to multilateralism, they say we are a multipolar world. We have many centers of power across the world. If they say that we all want to have equal say in how we govern the world, and if that unilateral superpower says, I will not be there, then the rest of the world comes together and say, we can be multilateral, and that this declaration is the result of such multilateralism, and we will never go back on what we have now started. And I believe that is the second great achievement of the G20. It gave birth to a multilateralism, not simply a multilateralism on paper, but it had guts. Because you must understand, for us, that every country who came there did so despite the pressure on them not to be there. Every country who signed the declaration did so knowing that Donald Trump did not want it. Every country that agreed to the theme of equity, diversity, and inclusion and solidarity did so knowing that the unilateral superpower does not want it, and yet they did it. And so I think it was a multilateralism of the brave, if I can paraphrase. And I think the fact that Chancellor Merz spoke to Donald Trump afterwards and said, you can't do this, I think it is a courage that could be enduring if we nurture it properly.
Ambassador, economics, finance, I think one of the major topics with regards to what happened over that weekend, and a lot of it, of course, with President Ramaphosa saying Africa needs to be an influential voice in the way the economy, inclusive economic growth. Do you feel that South Africa has done enough within its G20 presidency to really have that inclusive economic growth, especially when it comes to the debt burden of many of the African countries?
I think South Africa has laid a very clear foundation, and I think that the fact that 19 of the G20 signed up to it is important. Just the idea of debt restructuring for the least developed economies in Africa and in the global South, I think is a major win, because the payment of debt means that you can't pay for health, for education, and for infrastructure and so forth. So if we implement that one, it is absolutely critical. The second thing, forcing a review on the credit rating system, meaning that your credit rating system is directly responsible for your interest rates. If you want to fund your projects in your country, that would be a major relief. The third one is the thing on critical minerals. If we can get the investments into Africa and the global South for how our critical minerals are processed, then I think we add jobs and we add value to our local economies. And the fourth thing is that there are now new markets that are opening up for Africa to replace AGOA, to replace the USA. And so, for example, the inter-global South trade is going to be absolutely critical. And so, for example, on the sidelines or just in the run-up to this G20, China decided that it will buy 5 of the fruits that are no longer going to the USA. So now we have a market for 5 of our fruits, which is absolutely critical. And I think that that's what, and then of course, the finances that have come from the European Union for our renewable energy campaigns is absolutely critical. And then the last thing that I think that I want to mention, but it's not the last on the list, is that the United Kingdom put in a huge deposit to replenish the global fund so that we can fight HIV/AIDS, TB, and malaria. And that, I think, takes an enormous burden off African shoulders.
Ambassador Rasool, we've got about a minute. How would you rate South Africa's G20 presidency?
I think I will simply echo what many of the global leaders said, that it was one of the most profound and one of the most difficult ones, but it was certainly one of the most successful ones, because people showed up with their courage and they did whatever they did despite the absence and despite the threats from the United States of America.
Ambassador Rasool, always good having you on. Shukran so much for joining us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
That's Ambassador Ebrahim Rasool, a former South African ambassador to the United States. Well, the conversation will continue with regards to the US, saying that South Africa cannot attend next year's G20 summit. My conversation will move to Professor Patrick Bond from the University of Johannesburg. Do stay tuned.